Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session, The Ghosts We Inherit, Fiction and Poetry. We're adding in poetry. We've got Sy Hoahwah here, who's a poet, and Brandon Hobson, who's a fiction writer, and I'm Toni Jensen. I write fiction and nonfiction. So I'll be the moderator for today's panel, and I'll introduce the panelists, and we'll have some question and answers about ghosts and darkness and heritage and imagery and all sorts of other things in our work. And then at the end, there'll be time for questions. So be sure to put your questions in the chat and we'll leave time for those at the end of the panel. And thanks for all of you for coming out on a Saturday. So I'll introduce Brandon Hobson first. Brandon Hobson is the author of highly acclaimed novels, The Removed and Where the Dead Sit Talking, which was a finalist for the 2018 National Book Award for Fiction and the winner of the Reading the West Book Award. His other books include Desolation of Avenues Untold and the novella Deep Ellum. His work has appeared in the Pushcart Prize Anthology, The Believer, The Parish Review, Conjunctions, Noon, and McSweeney's, among other places. He's an assistant professor of creative writing at New Mexico State University and teaches in the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Hobson's an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation tribe of Oklahoma. Sy Hoahwah is Comanche Southern Arapaho and received his MFA in creative writing from the University of Arkansas. He's published 3 collections of his work, Ancestral Demon of a Grieving Bride this year from University of New Mexico Press, Night Cradle and Velroy, and the I'm sorry, how do you pronounce that, Sy?
Matichai.
I would have butchered it, and I'm already butchering it. Okay, and Matichai Mafia. That's a cool word, from West End Press in 2009. In 2013, Sy was a recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship. And I'm Toni Jensen. I'm the author of 2 books, Carrie, Survival on Stolen Land, a memoir out last year, 2020, from Valentine Books, and a collection of short stories from the Native Stories series at Nebraska Press in 2010. I teach full-time at the University of Arkansas in the MFA program and part-time at the low residency MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. So connection with Sy through how he was in the program here, but before I was here, and connection with Brandon through how we're colleagues at IAIA. I was a 2020 recipient of the NEA, and I'm Métis, and that's probably about all you need to know before we jump in. So I'm going to ask you some questions about ghostliness and horror and imagery and other fun things found in your work. But I'd like to start with setting. You both develop setting so well in your work. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little about the role of place or land in your most recent poems and novels. Sy, would you like to start?
Okay. With setting, well, coming from a Indigenous oral tradition, setting does have significance in my writing, and also in my first book and my second book. My second book, not necessarily geographically, but probably more on an emotional way. For me, pertaining to my second book, and so it's always been there. You know, it's always been an anchor as well. As you can say, literally a diving board. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that shows for sure in the writing. Brandon, how about you? What about place and land in your most recent novel or last couple novels, maybe?
Yeah, well, my last 2 have taken place in my home state of Oklahoma, and more specifically northeastern Oklahoma, where I have family, and so around the Cherokee Nation. One of the things that I really wanted to incorporate in my new novel, The Removed, is how land the setting and land remembers history just like we do. So the land remembers history and trauma, and so that was one of the things that I was doing in the. There's a lot of detail to descriptions of the land and setting in this new novel, and part of that is because it's so much of the book is about trauma and about violence, specifically the violence against Native people, and so I wanted to reflect that through the land, the descriptions of the land and the setting.
Yeah, I took a similar approach, but unfortunately it's a non-fictional topic, right? In my book, Carrie, which is about land and place and gun violence against all people, but in particular against Indigenous people. So I say unfortunately because it's terrible to write about real life things and have to craft the land in relation to, you know, some of that violence. But in fiction, I think it's just, and in poetry, it's just as important to show those connections between what's happened historically and what's happening today. And I think you're both really doing that in Sy in your poems, and Brandon definitely in The Removed. Absolutely. You can see the ways in which what has happened is still happening in many ways in both your work.
And to add to that,
yeah.
I mean, I think one of the ways we can do that in fiction and certainly I think poetry as well, is that we're able to sort of make the weather more temperamental as it fits the characters, and the effect for the reader that has this, I think, a certain effect for the reader that we're able to describe weather in a certain way, in the way that more than just describing the land is the things that we can do, I think, with gravity and with what the weather's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And poets, of course, have that available too. Yeah.
Well, Oklahoma itself it's in the Bible Belt, yes, but if you look beyond that, it's pretty unique because, as in the northeastern part, really different from the southwestern part. You know, the trees grow a lot shorter, but my point, Oklahoma, always you don't get a definite landscape. You don't get a definite grounding. It's like with the land, it changes, it transforms, and that, you know, that's reflected. And definitely my writing, my first book, writing about the areas around Lawton and whatnot, how the land holds so much, not only geographically, culturally. You know, first book, the Wichita Mountains play a big part, and that's been a significant historical place for the Comanche. And so, along with that, I try to implicate that in both books. With the second book, not, like I said, much more emotionally, much more, not to sound hokey, more spiritual, like on the other side of the curtain, if you will. So.
Yeah, and Momaday's written a lot about that area as well, right down there.
Mm-hmm.
Is right.
Yeah, being Kiowa, yeah.
Yeah, being Kiowa, yeah, but yeah, Rainy Mountain.
Yeah. Sy, when you mentioned the writing about kind of the other world too, I did have a question for both of you, since the topic is the ghosts we inherit. You both do seem to have ghosts and ghostliness and otherworldliness too, you know, the afterlife or the past world or the spirit world, or you know, any of the names that anyone wants to call it. I'm wondering how you approach that crossing over from being so embedded and doing such a good job, both of you, of describing and showing the land as it is in our world, and then how you shift back and forth between, these other worlds. There are so many skeletons, for example, Sy, in your book. It's like the skeletons have become a character in some way. And Brandon, you've got your bird in your book, the fowl in the remove that helps transition us. So I wondered if you all could talk a little bit about, kind of that transition between this world and the next or the other world, and how you manage that.
Go ahead, Sy.
Well, as a poet, part of, I guess, the part of the resume is to have the ability to walk in between or wear two hats, and not just necessarily with identity, but with your own skin, feeling comfortable in your own skin. And it's not necessarily solidified, but more, layers upon layers upon layers. And it's like my mentor Franz Wright, the late Franz Wright, he said, poets, they wear two hats. And it's easy to walk into one world and then into the other, and especially with my background not being so planted in the Judeo-Christian philosophy or theology, I was raised more the Indigenous way, and more of Comanche spiritualism, and also with the extended family, their beliefs as well, being around different belief systems and how they approach death and how they approach the whole cycle of that, of death, mourning, the whole, steps of grief and whatnot. So, and I've carried that into my writing for sure. So it's pretty easy, pretty easy for me to do that, I guess. Not a very big obstacle.
It's just a part of who you are, right? And what you believe and how you live. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Brandon, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think with this book, I was much more interested in exploring that and thinking about, like Sy being from Oklahoma, there's a lot of different sort of beliefs, it feels like. I mean, largely Christian, I think, but thinking a lot about spirituality in this book, and because the book is about how we grieve, the cycles of going through different stages of grief. I really wanted to explore that more, and think about how spirituality plays a role in grieving. And I hope I'm not lagging. Is my internet lagging a little
Sound
bit?
fine.
Okay, good. I'm worried because earlier it was lagging. So okay, good. So I mean that was really this is the first book where I've really explored that, and so much of the book also references some of the more traditional Cherokee stories that one hears growing up, and so how all that plays a role in dealing. And this book is about a teenager who gets shot by a police officer, and so it's really that happens. But the book is really about how the family is able to grieve and how to accept that violence that has been going on. I mean, we go all the way back to the American Indian movement in the 70s, and how that came out of violence from the police against natives and then 200 years ago, and all the government, the violence, and the way that they treated Indigenous people. And so, I was just really wanting to think about the spiritual aspect in dealing with all that, from ancestral trauma to current trauma.
Yeah, I think it's important to show the whole lineage of it, of how all of that is connected back and still live today. And I hadn't thought so much about that in relation to the spiritual world, or the afterlife, but it makes sense that those would be connected. And I hadn't thought about it much, but I do write about it. I guess I have chapters in my book too, where in Cary, where when I lived in Minnesota, and connecting the start of the American Indian movement to some of the violence there more recently with George Floyd, and a neighbor of mine that killed her sister, or her cousin rather, sorry. And so yeah, I can see how that can be traced then forward, right? That next step. That makes a lot of sense. And I've been asked more than probably any other chapter or question about my book. There's one brief part about ghosts, and since it's nonfiction, a lot of non-native people anyway, seem to feel like I was getting into fictional territory with the ghost section in the last chapter. And I mean, the things I experienced really happened, right? And so, in high school, my boyfriend's house was haunted, and I don't know what else to say about that. And it didn't cause anyone a whole lot of alarm. And so, I think it's hard for people to reckon with or understand that some of these things just are. And it wasn't a big part of the chapter even. So I'm always so surprised when someone brings it up like it's central in some way, or like I'd shifted into fictional territory. I'm just reporting what happened. And that it wasn't no one who experienced it. I mean, it was kind of remarkable the first time, right? Like when things happened, but after that, it's just like, well, the ghost is here, and you live with the ghost in the house, and it was mostly mischievous, not full of malice or anything. And I don't know. I was brought up, I guess, like Sy was saying, to believe those things are just part of the world, and that's okay, Yeah, so anyway, it always is interesting to me how much attention that little bit gets. And I think really there's a whole book here about guns and gun policy, but maybe that's harder to talk about, possibly. I also know we all have, and this is a shifting gear a little bit, but we all have a lot of birds in our books. And Brandon, I know you've probably been asked about the fowl in your book quite a bit, but there are other birds in your book, and Sy, so many of your poems had birds and bird imagery. Is there something, and people ask me all the time why there's so many birds in my book, and I have not come up with a good answer. Readers sometimes have come up with better answers than the ones I have. In my case, I think that I'm using them perhaps because I move all around the country, and birds are grounding, right? There's different birds, place to place, and that kind of is a marker of time and where I've lived. Also, my book is pretty dark, and I think sometimes the birds are bringing a little levity or a little beauty to a moment. But what about for you two? Why the birds, and what function or symbolism or imagery do you think they're providing in your books? Or maybe, Sy, in your case, in individual poems even.
It's like it's like you said a moment ago. The early or late 19th century fiction writer Frank Norris and the story of San Francisco, and it's basically about this couple, their courtship, and how the wife won a lottery, and how after she won the lottery, it was just like their utter demise, and they're sent into violence and greed and even death. The husband, McTeague, miner's background. And throughout the book, it's beautifully written, but there's this image of a canary, and that canary is like shows actually a symbolic connection to McTeague's used to use canaries to monitor, gas, whatever, they're digging. So I kind of think of like in this second book, I use the cardinal, and I kind of think of it like that, like, well, how deep into the mind are we, for the reader? And the cardinal also holds a cultural significance of Comanche because of color red. It means good luck. If you see one, that means you're going to have a good day, or things are going in your direction. And I use that, like I said, in my book, but I also show the canary as there's an imagery of the canary. Not the canary, but the cardinal being skinny. So the card stands for good luck. That could be stretched as well, and so it's kind of indicated throughout my book. The levity of, or the tone, or whatnot going through. So
Yeah, there's that. That's one of my favorite lines from your book, "Skinny cardinal for a wedding ring." I love that. Yeah, skinny cardinal for a wedding ring. I just thought that was really beautiful and interesting from Six Fingers. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, Brandon, what about you?
mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a great line. Skinny cardinal for a wedding ring.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, I wanted to draw attention. Again, part of it in this book was to go back to earlier, to drawing attention to the land and what was happening, and for each specific scene, I tried to use birds in different ways, partly drawing attention to the color, but also partly drawing attention to metaphor. Like early on, the character Edgar, who ends up going to this place that's mentioned in traditional Cherokee as the Darkening Land, which is a place that's mentioned in some of the old traditional Cherokee stories, which is a place that's very sort of desolate, and I didn't want to really have any kind of birds or colors in that, except for the fowl, and I call the red fowl, is the fowl in terms of Edgar, it's used as a metaphor for his really for his addiction. And so early in the book, and early in Edgar's sections, when he's given from friends, he's given a baby red fowl. I chose to use the word fowl because it's I'm trying to draw attention to the language. That it's kind of a more cryptic word, I think, than using a pretty word like cardinal or dove or something pretty. So fowl has it's kind of like grackle. It's a little bit more cryptic sounding, and so when I used that to show that it was constantly sort of following him. It was always on his shoulder, this fowl being his addiction, and that he was never really able to get away from the addiction. And so, and that's just one example. But the other examples have to do more with drawing attention to what's going on with grief, and drawing attention to the land. So when Maria, for example, is sitting out, looking out over the lake, and I tried to draw more attention to the sort of peacefulness. This is a calm for her dealing with her grief, and so I tried to use them to sort of show how the characters were healing, if that makes sense. So I used it I used them in various ways.
Yeah, I think that's very clear in the book that at some moments the birds are bringing healing and beauty and some color, and then in other times the fowl in particular just has that ominous presence. So yeah, you're developing that really well throughout. I guess there are hawks that recur in my book, and I just finished Hydrodrick's new book of poems, Little Big Bully, and she has a poem in there about hawks, where we're in a slightly future world, and even the mention of a hawk, or like bringing back the hawk, brings back some sort of hope or some sort of momentum toward the future and toward the past. And I just love that idea. And I don't know, I'd love to just steal that and say that's what I was doing, but it's nonfiction. And when I was at Standing Rock, camping and sorting donation clothes during the water protector time there were hawks there, and you couldn't not, it's so flat and wide, and the sky is so big there. It's not like here in Arkansas where there are the tall trees, and so those hawks were really prominent, and I couldn't keep my eyes off them. And so they came up there, and then I moved as I was writing this book to where I live now in South Fayetteville in northwest corner of Arkansas, and there's a big open field behind my house, and there's a pair of mated hawks there. And so it seems like it's just the literal for me on one hand, but on the other hand, birds are a thing that I notice, and I do associate the hawks in my field probably in some metaphoric way with those other hawks, right? And so it is a thing I do too when I travel, try to notice how many hawks and try to count them, just because traveling can get long. So I think hawks probably more than any other bird. But the bird I get asked about a lot is in the first chapter. There were robins, and I mentioned that a group of robins is called a riot, and that seems wrong because robins seem so ordinary, general public kinds of birds, like they're not ever going to riot. And then I talk about the men in riot gear at Standing Rock, and how the only people who were dressed up for a riot really were the police and the sheriff's office and the hired security. So I guess there are ways in which, like you say, Brandon, I'm probably using birds differently too, sometimes to bring hope and beauty and kind of the majestic way that like a hawk flaps its wings, or doesn't really flap, just glides, and then an everyday bird like a robin.
I thought about that when I read your book. I was thinking about, because it's so much of it has to do with gun violence, and then there's of course racism sections in there, but then we had those sections where you describe the birds, and so I wondered about sort of juxtaposition between those. So yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I feel like if you're giving a lot of violence, like I do in my book, that you have to account for balance too, and think about the way that's going to hit the reader. I'm always mindful of it's good to put things that are traumatic out there if you're doing so in a way that also is balanced, I think, and moves toward something beautiful or something meaningful, or you're making connections. Otherwise, are you moving toward trauma porn? None of us wants to be like J.D. Vance in that Appalachia book, and so to name one, we're wanting to avoid that, I think, generally, poverty porn and moving toward trauma porn. And so I feel like the birds are helping to give some beauty and some balance, for sure. I do think about that when I write, absolutely. Yeah, not all our stories are sad. Okay. Also, I did want to ask you to there's a musicality side in your work for sure, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of your influences in either music or in musical poetry. And Brandon, there's an awful lot of music in music influence in your last two novels, and so I was wondering if you two could talk about music or musicality, either one, in your writing.
Yeah, I guess so. I listen to a lot of music. It's like not much powwow music, or I listen to some of my favorite bands like the Black Angels out of Austin. I listen to them a lot. I don't know. It just helps mood, I guess. Just turn up and just zone out and start writing. So I guess that collects, into the work along. in poetry, of course. You look at the history of poetry, all the way to the Greeks, it was, pretty much lyrical. So I guess that has trickled down, into my work somewhat. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That there's both the long history of music and musicality and poetry going all the way back, as you say, and then also, yeah, I think what we listen to in present day finds its way in for sure. I'm sure that's the case in my writing too. Brandon, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same. I mean, I listen to a lot of music, and so I feel like that because somewhat the book has to do with pop culture, and or it doesn't have to do with pop culture, but I wanted to incorporate some pop culture, and how history plays a role. So, for example, the foster boy Wyatt, when Wyatt shows up to the house, I made, he was kind of a music obsessive, but it's all the music he listened to was the old big band and jazz and blues and stuff from the 40s, 50s, and the reason I wanted to do that is so he had a connection with Ernest, and so I think for the other mentions of music really has to do with my own. They're not put in there to do anything to story necessarily. It's just because I love listening to all different kinds of music, and I like to put those references in there in my work.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense too. Wyatt in particular, when he shows up in the removed with his, interest in music from the past, it really does do a lot of good work with connecting him, as you say, to Ernest, but also just with connecting him with the past, which seems really important in the novel. And so I liked the way that he's just such a charming character. He's just young and like precocious and dapper, he's very well dressed and he likes the old time music. And instantly I felt like the music helped craft his character. So it really, in his case, it really is doing a lot.
Yeah, and also, I didn't want him to be a stereotype of a foster kid too. He's a foster kid, but so much of this book is trying to write through stereotypes, I think, and for people not familiar with, especially Oklahoma, and so, and especially foster kids, what the stereotype of foster kids or native foster kids are like, and so that was another reason. So history, the connection with Ernest, and then breaking through the stereotype.
Yeah, I think that I know a lot of writers. Stephen Graham Jones is a writer who has something, if he's listening to one kind of music or one particular, band or even album, he'll listen to that over and over. That'll become the soundtrack of what he's working on when he works on a novel. And I'm always interested in that. I don't necessarily think of myself as a writer who does that, but when I'm working on something, I'll have the same maybe 3 or 4 things playing in the car all the time. And I spend a fair amount of time in the car, generally driving places. I mean, not as much lately, but during the pandemic, but, pre-pandemic, I traveled a lot. And yeah, and so I guess I do associate with certain essays or parts of my last book. I do really associate certain songs, certain bands, certain kinds of music. So it's interesting. I never thought of that until I heard him say he sort of formally did it, and I thought I'm probably doing that just a lot less, formally. I'm less aware.
Yeah, and I do sometimes for a scene, like for example, when his girlfriend gets mad at him and she storms out, she leaves the house basically and just leaves him. And what was playing on the record player was this old jazz, Ornette Coleman, I think, from from a long time ago. So this old kind of wild trumpet. And I knew that in that scene, I wanted them to be listening to something chaotic, which to me, and listening to jazz, there's all just, it's for me, it's hard to find a specific rhythm in listening to old, to sort of wild jazz. And it's hard to hear that, but it just feels chaotic a lot of times. I know that's probably, that may be really ignorant of me to say that, but I mean, but sometimes jazz, it's hard for me to hear a rhythm in jazz, and so that was a scene where I knew I wanted something chaotic. I could have used metal or something really hard rock, which I don't know, might have been as effective, but it just felt like the chaos of the scene. So the music was used specifically in that scene to show, the how furious she was with him when she stormed out of the house.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know enough about jazz to say, but it strikes me in a similar way. Old jazz versus modern jazz. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I enjoy it. I do listen to it, but I don't know that I understand it or what it's doing very well. So
Yeah.
I can't help you there. You both brought up in your last couple of answers, Oklahoma and stereotypes and sort of getting it right or getting it wrong. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you don't have to talk about ways in which other people get it wrong, but how you're working toward, crafting, because the ghosts we inherit is our topic. And I feel like one of the ghosts I inherit everywhere I live is what people think of a place and versus what the place is actually like when I live there, and how I'm always striving to get, I've lived so many places, and how I'm always striving to get past what I know people in New York or Los Angeles, for example, think, which is so often, I think, so surface or so bare minimum about the middle of the country. And Oklahoma in particular is a really complicated place. It has a lot more nuance and complexity, I think, than people give it credit for. And so I'm wondering if there are ways in which you're kind of writing back to stereotypes of your own particular tribal people or the place that you're from, or Oklahoma maybe overall. I mean, are there ways in which your work is sort of shifting away from, the stereotypes or trying to, or reckoning with them maybe? Sy, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, trying to write about Southwest Oklahoma, I guess. In my first book, I really tackled that. I really tackled about establishing what was community identity in the 21st century, and to take it out of the box, which is, for me, the way I've experienced that box is, Southwest Oklahoma, armpit of America, and with the Indigenous peoples, it's all about powwows and whatnot, and tribal homecomings, and the identity, even more today is more complex than that. It goes beyond the powwow circuit. It goes beyond alcoholism or drug abuse. Those, yes, they are there. Yes, they are prevalent, and yes, they are a result of history and cultural, heaviness, I guess, if you will. But my first book, I wanted to take it out of that and take it into, spread it out more. Like there's more world out here than what you expect. And with the second book, not much so. It was more as of subject matter for a native writer. taking it not necessarily geographically, but more, I hate to use the word spiritually, but more of the ethereal, I guess, if you will, to expand on that. It's not all about buffalo skulls and sun dances or ceremony. There's more to it, and especially today, living in the world that we live in, and you're getting stuff thrown at you constantly by media and by social media especially. Then you have to absorb all that in, and it definitely affect how you see yourself, how you see your people. And Native people, they are survivors, and this is once again another step in survival, adaptation, and so hope that makes sense. That was not a rambling on, but
No, that was a good answer, and it does make a lot of sense. And I really see you doing that in your poem about Fort Sill in particular. It's been 145 years. I am still surrendering to Fort Sill. Like, right? That's so specific in the way that it goes about doing, I think, what you're saying. Like, here's Fort Sill with all its history, but also the everyday comes into that poem, the lived reality of the everyday. And I think I see you doing that in a lot of the poems in Ancestral Demon of a Grieving Bride. So no, I mean, it makes sense to me having read this real recently. So
yeah, and it goes back to geography again, but certain layering. You have to peel back the layers.
yeah, no, I feel like I can often tell when people are writing about Indian country or when people are writing about rural America, even more broadly, whether or not they've spent time there. If nobody ever has a conversation with anybody, at a gas station or at a Walmart, I'm just not going to believe it. And your book has the layering of rural America as well as, specifically Oklahoma and specifically Indian country.
I don't know about the Midwest or Oklahoma. It seems like it's more prevalent of history. Like we walk around in it every day, as opposed to, and no offense to like the East Coast or West Coast, where it seems, or things are, they have their different patterns or different pace or different approach to everyday living, which every day that stacks up to where you distance yourself from history. With Oklahoma, particularly with all its complexity, it's really hard to do that. And it's a complex action within itself to not feel the effects of history when you live in the state of Oklahoma. Not only politically but historically, socially, because it's such a, it was, Indian territory, is that when, you have all this melting of cultures, of course, and then you have the land opening. And that kind of, that set the tone for Oklahoma for me, how Oklahoma is today. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Brandon, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that. The people that I've met from the East and West Coast and who have this, they're really not very educated. And no offense. I mean, but they're not really not educated the way that we are. Those of us who grew up in Oklahoma, right, and probably maybe the surrounding states. I don't know, but we in addition to even non-native people taking Oklahoma history, as which the public schools require Oklahoma history, of course, and so there's a lot. You forget, and I meet so many people from East and West Coast, or that really don't understand how the history of the state, and that it's Indian territory, that they tend to think that it's just kind of a white conservative state, right? So they don't even know how many tribes, how many, Oklahoma has entire state full of, what is that, 38 or 39 tribes, right? That a large part of the state that I of course, I'm always proud to say, and talk about my experiences growing up. One of the things that I loved about being a kid, one of my great memories, and going, like Sy saying, going beyond powwows or anything, was and Sy, did you go to any of the fast pitch tournaments, softball tournaments, when you were younger?
Back in the day, yeah.
That used to be a huge. I don't know if it still is, but when I was a kid, I remember going.
It's not.
It's not.
I said no. It should be. If it's not, it should be a staple.
Yeah. That was. I mean, there was some amazing softball being played back, and we'd go into Oklahoma City, and they're just huge weekend-long tournaments in the summer, and in El Reno. We just all around the state. I remember just this huge, and my dad knew he had these friends that were playing, and we always go watch them. And when, it was just a big part of culture, I think, in the state that I've wanted to write more. I've wanted to write about that. I don't know if somebody should write. I think that would make a great book. Especially, talking to people who actually played. I don't know, a lot of those older guys, I don't know how many of them are still around anymore. But that was, through the 70s, from what I remember, in 80s, when I was a kid, watching that, and just really just the crowds that were there. And it was just a big part of my summers growing up, going around and watching those. And that's something that, I think that's part of the history of the state, especially when we're talking about how many different tribes were involved in playing, and that none of people don't know about that. It's fascinating, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I didn't know about it. I'm not from, Oklahoma is one of the few states in this part of the country I haven't lived in, but spent a lot of time in. Because, where I live now is very close. So I've driven through, I think, almost all of Oklahoma, multiple times, and spent quite a bit of time in Oklahoma City going to basketball games and Tulsa. So I guess I always think about basketball more than I think about softball, so that's good to know about, actually. Yeah. And I think too, San Antonio Book Festival, I think Texas is often overlooked. I lived in Lubbock for a good many years, and I think Texas is often overlooked in a similar way by both outside of it. There's a huge Native population in Texas, not reservations necessarily as much, right? But a huge population of people. And so when we talk about urban Indian centers and we leave out San Antonio or Dallas or Houston, I mean, we're not being, accurate either. And I think that's something to think about too. I try, when I write about Lubbock, always to talk about the history of Native people in West Texas, but not just in a past way, right? Of course, there were greater numbers at one point. But there's still a lived presence there, and there's still relationships there, even if Native people don't necessarily own nearly as much of the land or live on it as they used to. There's still, all the urban centers all across Texas still have large Native populations, so that's something to think about too.
Yeah, and Stephen Graham Jones is from Lubbock area, right?
Yeah. Yep, he's from around Midland, Odessa, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to show the covers of all our books, and then we'll segue into the chat. Here is Sy's book from New Mexico Press, Ancestral Demon of a Grieving Bride, Brandon Hobson's The Removed, Echo, HarperCollins, and then my book, Carrie, from Valentine Random House. All right, what do we have in the chat? Let's see. Looks like Richard Santos is asking if we have any recommendations for small presses or authors that we might not be familiar with. That's a great question. Thank you, Richard. Either one of you want to field that first? Or otherwise, I have a couple ideas.
Why don't you go ahead? I'm like,
I'm looking over here to see. Here, I do have it right here. Okay, so you might be familiar with Counterpoint Press from Therese Mayat's book Heartberries, or you might not be. But Counterpoint Press in March, right as the pandemic was hitting, so not very good timing, for a new writer, Dennis Staples. He's a Ojibwe writer from Leech Lake Reservation, and it's a kind of spooky, ghostly, funny coming-of-age novel that is mostly set in this world, but also deals with kind of the otherworldly. So I think if you came to this panel, The Ghost We Inherit, you probably would really like Dennis's book. And Counterpoint in particular just does, a terrific job with their books. Counterpoint, Catapult, out of Minnesota, I can't recommend highly enough both Milkweed and Coffee House Presses. And there's Grey Wolf there too, which I think a lot of people are more familiar with. But boy, I think Milkweed writers really are pushing the envelope right now with race and environmentalism. So if you're interested in those topics, I would recommend them. And then Hub City Writers out of South Carolina, they've got a collective now, and they're publishing a big prize for short story writers and some really good anthologies on the South and race and the environment. So Hub City Writers, I would give them a big shout out to. Okay, so those are my thoughts. What about you two?
The one I was going to mention, well, there's a couple. University of Oklahoma Press puts out a lot of good books. But also I want to mention Mongrel Empire Press, which is out of Norman, Oklahoma also. My friend Gary Hobson, The Road Where the People Cried. This is a book of poems, of his poems, that's really good. But Mongrel Empire is doing some really, really great stuff. I don't think they get the recognition they should. Janetta Calhoun Mish, I think, is the editor.
Yeah, she is.
I think.
Yeah.
She is, yeah. So those are the two that I had thought about.
Yeah, I was totally willing to stay on that question. So, Mongrel Empire, those are great suggestions. Milkweed.
Yeah, I think you're frozen up there a little bit, Sy. Did you have any other suggestions?
No, I was just agreeing with you. You two.
Okay. All right. I thought of another one too. There's they might not be newer, but they're new to me. Jaded Ibis Press, and they're doing a good job of publishing newer Native writers. I'm reading a short story collection right now by a Choctaw writer. It's not out in the world yet, but anyway, I'd say Jaded Ibis is one to look at too. Okay. Any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat, but be about your last chance for putting in questions. If not, I'll ask you all really quick one last question then. What are you reading right now, or what would you recommend? Like maybe one or two books you're reading or would recommend.
I'm reading so many. Did I interrupt you, Sy? I'm sorry. I think you.
Go ahead.
I think you froze. I didn't know if it was mine.
Yeah, it's kind of glitching
Glitching a little bit. um, I was the book that I just picked up was Jamie Figueroa's. You have it there?
I do. I was going to recommend it too.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Brother, sister, which I have not started yet, but that's what I'm going. I'm right now, because of the semester, I'm just buried in reading student work. But between New Mexico State and IAIA, my students, I'm just, I always try to put my students, at the top, of course, but until the summer when I could. But when I do, I do reserve some time for my usually the weekends. And so yeah, but that's the one that I'm going to start real soon is Jamie's book.
Yeah. Any book recommendations, Sy?
Right now with my schedule and with work, I didn't have the time to really still have a long list I got to catch up on.
I
Yeah.
now.
So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have one more then. I was going to recommend Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer, Jamie Figueroa's new book too, and also Danae writer Danielle Geller's Dog Flowers, which is really interesting. Written. She was an archivist before she was a writer, and so she takes kind of a archivist perspective to writing her own life. It's a memoir, and to writing about her mother who grew up on the Navajo reservation, and then they lived in Florida. They lived all over the country, and so I think it's a really beautifully written book, and so I'd recommend that. I see one last question in the chat from Janet about supporting have any of us supported our local schools to have a writing program or connected with a project for the kids to write. There are programs here in Fayetteville in Arkansas through the public library, and I've done some work there, and that's been really, really fun. And so yeah, our MFA program also has a Writers in the Schools program, and our MFA students go out all over Arkansas and meet and do writing workshops with kids. So they tweet about it. If you follow Arkansas MFA, the Twitter, they'll post little lines from students' poems and things, and that's really fun. The students really get a lot out of that. How about either one of you?
Do they still publish it? Do they still publish that in the journal they come out with?
They do. Yeah. I think the pandemic years may be a little different. I imagine a lot of that was virtual. But so I don't know if there'll be a book this year, but I would think so. I would think they'd still do one. Yeah, it's great. It's in the students, it's one of the things they remember most from being here in the MFA is how much fun that is.
Yeah.
I just last month talked to the dean here at New Mexico State to try to open up a scholarship for Native kids through a creative writing creative writing contest to do once a year. So I've been meeting with, and this is through and my involvement as a faculty mentor with the American Indian program here on campus is I wanted to open up more possibilities for young Native students, and so we're looking at starting a scholarship for sure. I would like to. I'm really trying to get money too, but it's with the budget stuff, it's so hard. But I know that I can get some scholarship money for students who are interested if they end up coming to New Mexico State. But the main point is I want to really open up more possibilities for specifically Native students for creative writing awards for fiction, poetry, and nonfiction for mainly high school students thinking about college.
That's really great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks to both of you for joining me here today, Sy and Brandon, and thanks to the San Antonio Book Festival for having us, and thanks to all of you for showing up and asking good questions on a Saturday. We appreciate it. Have a good rest of the festival.
Thanks, Toni. Thanks,
Thank
Sy.
you.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Toni.
Okay.
Stay safe.
Yeah, you
Okay.
too.
Stay safe, everyone.